impact on lives, well-being, and economies in Asia and the Pacific, along with the rest of the world. Since the beginning of the pandemic at the start of 2020, ADB has committed more than $17.5 billion to help its developing member countries address the impacts of COVID-19 and address vaccination needs, and has mobilized a further $12.5 billion in co-financing from partners. From the earliest stages, ADB offered technical assistance to address Asia and the Pacific's most pressing needs, including medical equipment and supplies, improving laboratories, and training frontline workers. To mitigate the immediate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ADB committed $10.2 billion to support governments' counter-cyclical expenditure programs in 26 countries. Some $501.7 million has been helping private companies provide medical equipment and essential services. And ADB committed $3.2 billion for trade finance, supply chain finance, and microfinance programs. ADB is also providing crucial knowledge to help countries better tackle the pandemic and shape a greener recovery. This includes databases on policy measures, supply chains, and economic impacts. As the world kickstarts a sustainable recovery from COVID-19, ADB is delivering comprehensive support to meet Asia and the Pacific's vaccine needs. Through a $9 billion Asia-Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, announced in December 2020, ADB is providing funding for vaccine procurement, logistics, and distribution. The initiative also supports important investments to build capacity in vaccine delivery, community outreach, and surveillance. Throughout its COVID-19 response operations, ADB is working closely with partners, including other international financial institutions, bilateral institutions, and the UN system. ADB is adapting with agility to the region's changing circumstances, working together with its developing member countries to rebuild for a long-lasting recovery.
In 2008, an international research organization was founded that would seek to have a positive influence on relationships and policymaking within and between the countries of ASEAN and East Asia. This is AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia.
When AREA was first mooted, the thinking was we need a very substantial economic research body.
It's very important for an organization like ASEAN to have the backing academically for what it wants to do. And that's why AREA fills in the gap and helps provide the research.
It's more about providing the information that's needed for the negotiators or for the political decision makers.
We are not a pure academic institution. We must do the more practical policy recommendation.
And AREA's role, of course, is also to promote the talking through of sensible policy developments, and it plays a fundamentally important role in that respect.
And AREA is now accepted as one of the major research institutes in East Asia as a whole.
After its first decade of input into the development of ASEAN, AREA must now be ready to meet the challenges of the future.
We believe that issues like sustainable development, like environment, issues like education, humanitarian aspect of it, which we think AREA has the capacity to develop expertise and provide policy recommendation to ASEAN.
AREA, hopefully in the not too distant future, will become like the OECD of our region.
AREA will continue to contribute to the community building of ASEAN and East Asia.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues, such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision-makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together, recover stronger.
Good afternoon to our honorable guests and distinguished audience. Welcome to the third and final day of the 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue, an annual event held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies to discuss emerging global issues and their solutions.
This event is co-organized by the Asian Development Bank, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and T20 Indonesia. This year, as the side event of T20 Indonesia, this dialogue takes the theme of G20 Indonesia, Windows for Recovering Together and Stronger. On this honorable occasion, I, Gilang Kembara,
and I, Stella Kusumawardani,
will be the hosts for this event. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed society to adapt and adopt to digital transformation, innovation, and new technologies. Concerns arise as to whether these new technologies and innovation may displace unskilled jobs. As such, in order to unleash the digital potential, the education gap must be bridged and an inclusive way of human capital development must be developed. The fifth panel of the event, entitled Building Human Capital for Social Cohesion and Inclusive Digital Economy, will explore the various issues in developing human capital through digital means and to prepare for the future. Chairing this session will be Dean Tetsushi Sonobe, Chief Executive Officer and Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Prior to his current position at the Asian Development Bank Institute, Dean Sonobe served as the Vice President of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo and has taught economics at both Tokyo Metropolitan University and GRIPS for 30 years. Dean Sonobe is a recipient of the Nikkei Book Publication Prize and the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize and a founding board member of the Japanese Association for Development Economics. Before we commence, we kindly invite our participants to post questions and/or comments during the Q&A session. For the audience attending here at the venue, please provide your question to any of our organizers, whom will then pass them to our moderator. For our virtual attendants, please write your questions and/or comments at the Zoom Q&A box or YouTube comment section. I would like to kindly suggest to keep your questions short and straightforward. Don't forget to inform us of your name, your affiliation, and the speakers whom you would like to address your question, if any. Without further ado, It is thus my pleasure to welcome Dean Tetsushi Sonobe to chair the session. Dean Sonobe, you may have the screen.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Stella and Giran, for kind introduction. Good afternoon from Tokyo. Welcome to Global Dialogue Day 3, Session 5, Building Human Capital for Social Cohesion and the Inclusive Digital Economy. I'm Tetsushi Sonobe, the Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute and the think tank of ADB. It's an honor and a pleasure to moderate the discussion in this session, where we will explore the issue of learning losses due to the prolonged school closure, growing inequality, and the way government can work to mitigate some of these challenges going forward. We will discuss this issue while paying special attention to digital transformation of the economy and education. Because the silver lining of COVID-19 is that the use of digital technology can help mitigate learning losses over time on one hand, but on the other hand, there are concerns that technological innovation may displace unskilled jobs and aggravate economic inequalities. I'm delighted that we have very distinguished speakers. The lead speaker is Professor Chris Rowley of the University of Oxford, whose speech will be followed by panel discussion with Dr. Zia Qureshi, Dr. Sukti Dasgupta, and Dr. Lorraine Salazar. So the Professor Rowley is tuned in from UK, and then Dr. Sukti is from Switzerland, and then especially Dr. Zia is tuning in from the US. I think it's very, early in the morning, maybe 3 a.m. Thank you very much for your kind, participation. Thank you very much. So I will introduce Professor Rowley now, and then after his speech, I will introduce the panelists. Professor Rowley is a graduate of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, or CIPD, and his BA and MA in Warwick University, and earned a DPhil in Nuffield College, University of Oxford. He has more than 30 years of experience of many university systems in the UK, Europe, and Asia, which include establishing the Center for Research in Asian Management at City University of London, UK. He holds positions in Kellogg College, University of Oxford, Bayes Business School, City University of London, Tohoku University in Japan, and the University of Business and International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. So Professor Rowley, the floor is yours.
Hopefully I'm now unmuted. I just need to share my screen, which I think I can do with that, and a slideshow from the beginning. Right, so hopefully...
Professor, could you make it presentation mode?
Excuse me?
So bigger than,
bigger
presentation
than that,
mode.
Slideshow, play from start. There we go.
Great, yes.
As you've probably gathered from that, I'm not a technologically efficient person.
No, very well. Thank you very much.
I will be the only person you meet today who does not own a mobile phone. There you go. It's my only claim to fame. My wife isn't impressed with that fact. So at least we've got the technology going. So once again, to reiterate some of the points, thank you very much for the invitation. I was delighted to accept. Thank you very much for such a warm introduction to this presentation. I've got probably more slides than I will use because I never know really where I'm going to go or where the audience wants me to go. But the structure will be the same, which is basically a couple of big questions I was asked to address about schools or education institutions and digital transformation. And because of the way my mind works, I'm always thinking of practical solutions. And so I'll end with some of those, basically, in terms of what I think needs to change. Otherwise, we can go back to pre-COVID if you wish. But I think it gives us an opportunity to build back better. We can do something more. So I called the talk something to do with context and leadership. Because without both of those things, we will repeat what we've done before. And I think that'd be a terrible loss and shame, given all the pain and suffering we've been through since March 2020, and the UK anyway, not to do that. And so really I was asked to speak on these sort of big complex topics about the impact of COVID on human capital accumulation. So broadly, something to do with education closures, learning losses, how that impacts on productivity and human capital. And then something to do with what was being used to try and get us through and what we're using today, of course, some digital transformation, given the fact that educational access will be diverse. For some people, it's not a great deal of difference. To other people, it'd be radically different. What do you mean we need a laptop to go to school? You know, don't own a laptop, the family hasn't got one. Other families will have that technology. And the part of that is the mismatch in demand for skills. So I thought I'd provide some short initial thoughts to each of these big questions and then set out these overarching points I mentioned at the beginning in terms of suggestions for policymakers, practitioners, government, and the leadership, I think, or the type of leadership that's required. And so there's a common cultural expression in the UK called "don't teach your grandmother to suck eggs," which I think comes from Germany. And what it means is don't try to teach people more than they know about it already. And so I don't know the audience, I don't know the rest of the panel that well. Therefore, I am not going to spend a lot of time explaining human capital theory to them because I'll be teaching you to suck eggs otherwise. You know better than that. The example I always give is my father, who was an engineer. I would not dream of talking about engineering to my father because he would know far more than me. So he would accuse me of teaching grandmother to suck eggs. So I'm not going to do that with the audience. You probably know more about Becker and human capital theory than me. But basically, it's the linkage between investments in yourself and outcomes. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some examples of, we all know the scarring effects. I've just got 3 examples for you here. One's from the OECD, telling you you're going to earn about 3% lower income over their lifetime. Students, nations about 1.5% lower GDP. And it's worse for the disadvantage because they're less support. The World Bank from December last year, 21, covering 145 countries. Again, economic scarring and schooling shock, as they call it. But they took a slightly different angle, arguing it would damage high-income economies most because they've got more schooling to start with and they get a higher return to their expertise. It's a slightly different take. And the last one I was just going to give an example of was from last month from the IMF itself. And again, they've come up with a damage to earnings. And they've gone for a really big global picture, basically $17 trillion of lifetime earning losses. But interestingly, those closures lasted twice as long in developed countries. And that was magnified again because, again, the share at school was double. And so I won't spend too many minutes on the evidence because you can all see it, but there's a chart for the IMF I took from February, and it clearly shows, you know, a disparity in weeks of closures of schools. That's what he's trying to show you, from the dark blue all the way through to the red. So I thought that was quite interesting sort of way to set the context so we don't just focus on one country, one region, but and more of a global one. And that's the same thing I took from the IMF. Again, just a forecast of the decimation of economies by COVID. It just happens to be the Philippines at the bottom, minus 13%. Well, everybody's in there: China, Taiwan, Malaysia, UK, Brazil. Shows a pretty consistent picture of loss from smallish to large. And so that was sort of the background I thought I'd spend a couple of minutes on. In terms of the questions, it was these that I was asked to sort of think about. How have school closures affected the economy? Well, clearly an initial impact because it was just a shock. But of course, that takes time to work out and set up. And that, of course, then varies between the quality of the education system. For example, some South American education systems versus Western Europe. And within families, of course, they vary totally. Even in the UK, you'd have some families with huge finance and support for their children, and others who haven't got that. So clearly that's a difference. The impact on productivity and capital in the long run, well, I'll get to this at the end of the talk. It depends on your view of productivity and human capital, how broad or narrow that is. Because of course, productivity isn't just about using labours, it's about how much they produce. And if it forces investment in skills and technology, productivity will increase. So it's going to increase human capital if it causes investment in skills. I suppose what sort of policies, I came up with a set here to mitigate them. I think a key one will be, if the world ever goes back to normality in terms of schools, what you may well find is within class variations will be wider. That's happened in the UK, where people have been out of school, but they've gone back with different levels of learning online. And so that class is less coherent, less cohesive, less consistent. It's more individualized with a different range of ability. So I think that would be a shock. So the teaching workforce needs to cope with that. And of course, at the same time, develop skills for a new range of activities, whether that's trying to continue with a bit of online education. Of course, state and government supports are critical to this one in terms of investment. That's either by tax incentives to encourage those behaviours, nudge theory as it's called, or tax penalties to encourage investment. So unless you do it, you'll pay a tax benefit. That's very much a UK model at the moment for apprenticeship training. Unless you provide apprenticeship training, you will pay a levy. So you might as well spend it on training, don't pay the levy. That's been coming through the system the last 20 years. Because I think the ultimate aim is to build back better. This is how I started my speech about it'd be a terrible shame just to carry on with what we had before, but I think we can build back better and differently. Rather than just pumping in more of the same hours, the same input to make up the shortfalls of lost learning, I think I'd like us to think about doing it better. And that really brings me on to the sort of the meat of the talk, which was, if I get the next slide, the prescriptions would be something like that. I think to build back better, to make up that loss of human capital input, it's about knowledge, it's about thinking, it's about skills. And of course, all those are underpinned by the need for some sort of leadership. It's not going to happen on its own. Inertia is pretty impressive. You know, it doesn't like to change things. We think back of famous models of change by Carl Lewin, and you know, it's the ice cube. The ice cube is frozen most of the time. COVID melted the ice cube. So before it refreezes, I'd like that ice cube to be reshaped. I don't want a square ice cube. I want a round one, or whatever shape it is you want. Now's the opportunity to do that, because once it freezes, change is difficult. Because most companies, that's why they don't change. COVID allowed systematic change all at one time across everybody, like working from home in the UK. It wasn't one company saying, oh, we'll be the innovators. We'll be the leading edge companies to do this, and everybody else carry on. No, everybody did it. And that's what COVID did. So I think I'll deal with those three in turn. I'm watching the clock, so don't worry. I think it involves types, doesn't it? There's one type. What sort of knowledge is it you're going to use for human capital? Individuals have knowledge, of course, explicit and implicit. Of course, companies, organizations have knowledge. I just listed the three there. The one we've sort of focusing on today is human capital, the education, values, experience of people. But they also have social capital and corporate capital. So I think what we need to do is not take our sight off the idea that what is it we're trying to build back better with? When we say, oh yes, it's about learning and knowledge, well, what? Exactly what knowledge? Is it individual knowledge? If so, what type? As we all know, implicit knowledge is important, or tacit knowledge is important, but difficult to transfer. You know, it's your own beliefs, tips, ways of doing things, a way to negotiate your way around Zoom. You can read the manual if you wish. I rarely do, I just try it. So I think that's the big one. Because of course, the nature of knowledge is that really, isn't it? The tacit knowledge is harder to transfer, but it's more useful often. So that's one big type of thing I think we need to think about. What is it, the knowledge we want to transfer? I think the second big thing we want to think about is how do we transfer that? I think it's especially important in uncertain times, which is where we are now, because developing and obtaining different ways of learning is key. You know, I shall keep banging on and re-emphasizing the point about trying to build back differently and better. Because, of course, most learning historically has been rote learning, you know, copy and paste, or a rote loop, for example. So the learning you have is about preparing for something, a test or an exam, and then you forget it and prepare for the next test and exam. Do we want to build back better with that sort of education, that sort of learning, or something different? Because, of course, the outcomes of rote learning, you know, particularly in schools, are that. What you're trying to do is copy and paste the same knowledge. You don't want anybody with a round thought. You all need to be square thoughts. And the education system's the same, isn't it? What you want to go is standardization. In you go. You squeeze out all the creativity, innovation, and out comes the standardized product. Is that what we want to build back better with? I think we need more than that. I think there are some alternatives we can build back better with. And I won't spend a lot of time on them, but a classic one is this, isn't it? It's a learning loop. Rather than a single loop, we should think of learning as a double or even a triple loop. The most common style of learning is just problem solving. You can apply it to COVID if you wanted. You know, we need a vaccine, off we go, get the vaccine. Double loop learning takes that a stage further, doesn't it? In terms of, it's not just fixing the problem of COVID. It's about why have we got COVID? How's it spread? What are the assumptions? And what can we do about the future? So it's more proactive, less reactive. So I think that's important to it. In terms of loop learning, not just the common rote learning, which is going to give you a single loop, but some sort of critical type thinking, which is some sort of problem thinking and a solution. And why is critical thinking important? Well, it involves a set of skills, that's for sure. You've got your problem solving, but it's about creativity, analysis, communication, open-mindedness. This is the opposite to rote learning. This is questioning things. And the reason that's important, I think, is everyone needs it, because societies need two things, don't they? To adapt to change, unless you can sort of lock your way away from it, you know, like North Korea tries to, or Japan back in the 19th century would try to. Unless you can do that, you need to adapt. How do you adapt? Well, you share common resources if we're to flourish. And again, COVID gives you great examples of that in terms of the development of the vaccine. The data was whizzed around the world thanks to technology. And so I think that's why we need critical thinking. That's why we need to teach critical thinking skills, really, because the more people can debate ideas with full consideration of the issues, I think the better will be the result.
Professor Chris,
yep.
Sorry, could you wrap up in 2 to 3 minutes?
Perfect, yeah. 2 to 3 minutes, not a problem. So I think critical thinking you can do by exchange of ideas in a reasonable debate. And I won't go through the way we can have a reasonable debate, but I think education is a great way to do it. And I shall just quote somebody I've never heard of who says education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And I think that's how I look at education. And so in the last minute, I've got something about skills, because of course, I think technical and human skills are important, but the skills we need are those conceptual ones. And the reason those are important is because it's about leadership, isn't it? And Robert Katz told us the more senior you are in a business, the more conceptual skills you need, the less technical skills you need. So as an academic, for example, when you start off, you need to be able to write papers. By the end, when you're a vice chancellor, you need conceptual skills. And so the final minute, sort of way I approached it was, how are those factors affecting effective leadership? And there's just the three, really. One is about context. Where is it you live? Is it Japan? Is it Geneva? Is it Oxford? Where is it you work? Is it a bank? Is it a real estate company? Is it the government? And of course, about you, your own predispositions, skills and traits. And so in the last minute, I've got there with my summary. There you go. I think we've looked at a couple of very complex issues that I could spend 2 hours on, about education and digital transformation. I think my takeaway would be this. It requires us to ask ourselves and reflect on key HR questions, the types of knowledge, learning, thinking and skills. And that in turn requires effective leadership and what underpins it, which again is a key HR issue. So I got there just about a few minutes over time, but thank you for the prompt and thank you for putting up with me.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Chris, for very insightful speech. Now I'd like to invite a panel discussion. There are three. The first is Dr. Zia Kresh, who is a visiting fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He also advises and consults for several other organizations. His research and commentary cover a broad range of global economic issues, including a current focus on how technology is reshaping the economic agenda. Prior to joining Brookings, he worked at the World Bank and IMF for 35 years. He holds a DPhil in economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. The second is Dr. Sukti Dasgupta, who is the chief of the Employment, Labor Market and the Youth branch at the ILO in Geneva. She has worked at the ILO regional office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok and in the field office in South Asia and East Asia. She holds a PhD in economics from University of Cambridge. She has journal and book publications in areas of employment, structural transformation, informality, and gender, and has extensive experience in working with policymakers on employment and labor market policies. Then the third panelist is Dr. Lorraine Salazar, who is a senior knowledge expert with McKinsey's Telecommunications, Media and High Tech, or TMT practice based in Singapore. She leads McKinsey's TMT infrastructure strategy service line and works globally on regulatory strategy, infrastructure strategy, fixed and mobile network technologies, spectrum strategy, and 5G. She obtained a PhD in political science and Asian studies from the Australian National University and has BA MA in Political Science from the University of the Philippines. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Zia first to make his opening statement in maybe 4 minutes. Dr. Zia, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, notwithstanding the hour in Washington, D.C. Professor Rowley has started us off well. In my remarks, I would like to place the challenge of building human capital in the larger macro context of a global economy that is experiencing major shifts and transformations. These shifts and transformations have important implications for the human capital development agenda. In the few minutes that I have, I will briefly make 3 points. First, the big driver of transformation we are witnessing is technological change led by the digital revolution. Automation and digitalization are shifting labor demand away from lower level skills to new higher level skills. In particular, labor markets are witnessing polarization, with demand shifting away from routine low to middle level skills that are more easily automatable. On the other hand, the supply of skills has been slow to adapt to this change. Education and efforts to upskill and reskill workers have been lagging in the race with technology. But this has 2 implications. One is rising income inequality as the premium on higher levels skills rises and lower skilled workers face diminished wage and job prospects. In the US, for example, research shows that between 50 to 70% of the increase in earnings inequality since 1980 is attributable to such effects of automation. The other implication is that the increasing mismatch between the skills available and the skills needed depresses productivity growth. This is an important part of the explanation of the so-called productivity paradox. That is, the paradox reflected in the fact that in recent decades that saw a boom in new technologies, aggregate productivity growth slowed rather than accelerated. My second point relates to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has reinforced some of the trends and the inequality increasing dynamics that I just mentioned. The automation and digitalization of economic activity is intensifying in the wake of the pandemic. And this has the effect of further tilting labor demand against low-skilled, low-wage workers. On the supply side, the disruption of education caused by the pandemic is hurting lower income groups much more seriously, those with less connectivity and fewer resources to adapt. Indeed, a lasting scar from the pandemic may be the education setback experienced by the young in low-income groups. At a time when technology is changing the nature of work in ways that are increasing the importance of education and skill acquisition for success in the job markets of the future. A recent study of Latin American countries finds that the pandemic may seriously undermine the region's progress in reducing education gaps across income groups. It finds, for example, that the probability of completing secondary education for children in economically disadvantaged households would fall from around 50% to 30%. And my third and final point is about implications for public policy. One clear implication is that investment in education and training programs should be boosted and reoriented to emphasize 21st century skills that complement the new technologies. Professor Rowley touched on that. This will require innovation in the content, delivery, and financing of these programs, both in the general education system and in vocational education, including new models of public-private partnerships. With the fast-changing demand for skills and the growing need for upskilling, reskilling, and lifelong learning, the availability and quality of continuing education should be greatly scaled up. The potential for technology-enabled solutions, such as online learning tools, must be better harnessed with improved, wider access. Persistent inequalities in access to education and training must be addressed. Here, in view of the pandemic-related education setbacks, particular attention must be given to remediation efforts to save the next generation of vulnerable youth from falling behind. While much of this agenda is for national governments, the international community, G20, multilateral development banks, and other international institutions have an important role to play, particularly in boosting support to the efforts of more resource-constrained developing economies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zia. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Sukti. Your turn, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to the ILO. In the few minutes that I have, I'll basically make 3 points. The first, that as we all discussed and we all know, and the two presenters before me highlighted, the impact of this COVID crisis has been so profound and so all-pervading that itself will have long-term scarring for many sections of the labor market. And let me also focus on the labor market because there are other experts talking on other issues. The second point, and I will go into some detail on that. The second point is that the way digital technology was used to overcome some of the impact of the crisis, and it was indeed a boon because it did limit the losses from employment and from education. It also led to a different organization of work and a different organization of education, some of which will have long-term impact. And finally, how does policy respond? Now, coming to the first point on the immediate impact of the crisis, the ILO has been estimating it ever since the crisis started. And the estimates for the Asia-Pacific region are quite grave. In 2020, the loss in working hours was about 8.2%, which led to about 145 million full-time jobs working at 48-hour week, if you calculate it in from that perspective, being lost. And in the Southern Asia region, it was even bigger. It was about 13.3% declines. Now, recovering from this huge decline, some of it will, of course, when the economies start operating again, some of it is recovered. But there are sections of the population who have been so badly hurt, and some sectors which we know took the brunt of this crisis, which will find it more difficult to get back on track. And let me mention in this context the women and young people, because our analysis finds that systematically across all regions, these were the groups which were worst affected, particularly young people. And if you take an intersectional approach, it is young women in particular, who were worst hit. And many of them left the labor market altogether and went into a status that we call inactive. And in other words, is also measured by the not in employment, education, or training. And it's going to be quite a difficult task getting many of them back into the labor market in a productive manner. The second point was there were also, despite the loss in jobs, there was also loss in productivity. And we see that across a number of Asian countries, Thailand, Mongolia, even Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore. And this again will have implications for sectors. Now coming to the digital transformation, which was really, quite major. And, we were seeing it even before the pandemic, the future of work trend, but it basically accelerated during the pandemic. And it universally has changed the way probably work is going to be delivered, because teleworking is becoming more and more a norm. We find, it's becoming part and parcel of many companies' policies, not only today, but also for the future, even as these companies recover from the impact of the crisis. But secondly, also education, which was already mentioned, but the scarring of the cohort of students is not going to be addressed simply by schools going back to where they were in 2020. But also in terms of skills development, we find a lot of major changes happening. TVET institutions are adapting quite significantly. Our surveys show that more than half of TVET institutions which never did online services prior to the pandemic are now making this part and parcel of their regular delivery of skills. And in the supply and demand side of the labor market, again, there are issues, as Professor Qureshi already mentioned. The demand for digital skills is growing exponentially, but not only digital skills, it's a combination of digital skills and cognitive and soft skills. That's what's really in demand. And on the demand for work, there is a new kind of trend, which was there even before the pandemic, which again has accelerated. And I really like to underline this. This is the growth of what we call the platform and the gig economy. Work which is done through the digital interface. And while it is really increasing, and it has also was a huge help, the deliveries, the online shopping, etc. during the pandemic. It has implications for the way work is organized, because the legislative structure or the regulations around this work are far less developed. So the questions of insecurity, questions of long-term progression, career progression for workers in these jobs, which really need a much stronger and a much more inclusive conversation to be addressed. And finally, and in the face of all these challenges, from the skills perspective, the question will be lifelong learning, which the member states of the ILO are already discussing, and how one finances this long-term learning, or learning over the life cycle, because also you see the retirement age is being pushed back. So there is an issue over there. But overall, in terms of how the world of work adopts to the new technology and to this big shock that COVID gave, and continuing shock, now we have other shocks in the form of geopolitical crisis, which also has impact on the labor market, is going to require a lot more social dialogue, between different stakeholders in society, and global coordination. And there the G20 also plays an important role, because at the end of the day, it will be global coordination as the world becomes much more connected in terms of how you address these labor market challenges. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suk. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Lorraine. Yeah, your turn, please unmute.
Thank you, Sonobe-san, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much to CSIS and the organizing committee for this opportunity to share insights in this discussion. I think quite a significant, important topic, right? As my colleagues have focused so much more on education policy and labor policy, let me focus on the aspect that I know best, which is technology as used in education. And I think the question of how the shift, as everybody has been talking about, of the shift and acceleration of the use of digital in education because of the pandemic. And finally, I think the most part I would want to focus on really what I see are the best practices in terms of building this missing infrastructure, fixed and mobile globally, right? Now, as a mother of 2 young children, right, I celebrate the fact that there's quite a lot of digital technology services that actually improves how kids learn, right? So if I can mention a few that that are top of mind that I think are trends that are happening, Supriya's mentioned this, trends that are happening before the pandemic and now are accelerated. First is really how with digital technology, there's a proliferation of remote learning platforms. You can think of Coursera, which is for more mature learners, or Khan Academy, for instance, for K1 to K12. They've been popular and they've actually delivered, they enable and deliver learning that has not been there in the past. So I feel this is, one of the upsides of digitization. It somewhat enables democratization of access. Of course, there's the question of the gap in the digital access, which I'll come to later, but I would recognize and celebrate that with digital technologies, we have online platforms. Secondly, I think technologies also allowed for a personalization of pace of learning, right? In the past, I need to be in the lecture room. I need to be in person with my professor or my classmates. Now there's a different pace of learning. It can be on demand. It can be in a different pace. It can also even be non-linear, right? And therefore that changes the way we learn. Thirdly is a personalization of content. One big aspect of this is now, instead of just getting standard lectures, you can actually look at things that are outside of what your curriculum asks for. Instead, you can also go look at skills, learn mindsets and different values, and stuff around using apps to learn. I'll cite one example. A friend of ours introduced us to a website called Preply, which is an online platform that links language teachers globally. And now from our home, my children can learn French from a teacher in Cameroon, right, who then earns an income from teaching 1 hour of French once a week. A Japanese expat living in Mexico, again, for $10 a week, he can teach my 10-year-old son basic Japanese. And things that are, in the past, they need to go to a language school, right? And so there's quite a lot of creative, innovative outcomes that I see happening because of digital technology. Now, however, and maybe here I have some slides to share, just highlighting what has been described now, right? Under the lockdown, one study from a joint UNESCO and World Bank actually said at one point in time, there's about 1.6 billion students who have been affected by different ways of closures. And because of that, we've already gone through this, right, earlier. There were different ways of shifting to online. And if you can see from a wide array of, if we focus on the global aspect, I think the biggest option here that we can see is a shift to using online platforms. Now, this, as we've also been mentioning, there is an income inequality that's coming out at play, and you can see in lower income and lower middle income countries, they also leverage traditional broadcast media as a way of shifting to learning under COVID, right?
Dr. Lorraine, could you wrap up in
yes.
30 seconds?
Okay, in 30 seconds. Okay, so I think maybe if it's 30 seconds, right? The one thing that I wanted to emphasize, and maybe during the discussion, I can get into the policy side, right? There's a lot of promise, right? But I think the challenge that's faced us is really the fact that access to services is very varied, right? I think in this slide, we can see the one big aspect of access is mobile technology. That has, even in Africa, about 90% of penetration. But I think much of it is still very varied with regards to the use and access of smartphones, right? So this is probably the core aspect of what policymakers as well as the private sector should look at with regards to alleviating this divide. I'll pause there, and I think I can get into the other details on policies later on. Thank you, Sonobe-san.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now let's move to discussion with 4 panelists, including Professor Chris. So as you know, these days, education technology or edtech is a kind of emerging industry. So the application of new technologies, including artificial intelligence to education. But and then the kind of one expectation is that kind of new technologies will help the teachers when they teach foundational skills or maybe relatively rote learning type skills, and then so that teachers have more time to work on the teaching in the related to critical thinking. But do you think the market can nicely develop nice technologies and also to lead to schools and parents and students to use those technologies in a good way, or there must be some government policy intervention to that market? So please talk about the kind of policy side. So Professor Chris, then Dr. Zia, and then Sukti, and then Dr. Lorraine in this order. So Professor Chris.
Thank you. I think I was muted. Yeah, there we go. Thank you to all the panelists. I've been trying to make notes as I've gone through. Thanks for a great question about will the market respond in terms of a shift from certain types of skills to use the word critical thinking if you want more innovative types of learning. I'll just give the example of the UK where I don't hold my breath. That's why I said it's about leadership. Because the government in the UK is driven by metrics. It's driven by measuring. And if your measurement is achievability in an exam, learning dates, for example, that is what they're going to be taught. To quote another famous American academic this was about pay, but it can be just the same. What gets measured gets done. And so if you measure that, it will get done. And if you don't measure it, it won't get done. And so all schools in the UK are in this sort of maelstrom of government manipulation, really, to make schools comparable, to try and create a sort of pseudo market. So you know what is a good school and what is a bad school because they achieve different targets. Now that's not the way to go, is it? That's why I ended mine about leadership. The Department of Education in Britain needs to have civil servants, advisors, and politicians that don't think that way. They need to think outside the box and say the future doesn't lie like that. The future's differently. So those are my points about I'd love the market to respond, but it's not free market. It's governed by the government, and it's governed by whichever the current Secretary of State for Education is. And our previous one was fascinated by dates. And so schools, my wife's a primary school teacher, and she had to go back to teaching dates of battles, dates of families. Nothing really conceptual about that. It's just the Battle of Agincourt, Battle of Hastings, because that's what they were measured on. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Zia.
Thank you. On the policy side, I mean, in terms of the human capital development agenda, I underscored the need to boost investment in education and training. But as others have noted, workforce development in the digital era is not simply government spending more. I mean, crucially, it also involves recalibrating education and training, putting more emphasis on the skills, cognitive, technical, professional, and managerial, that will be in demand in the digital era. Moreover, access to worker retraining will need to be greatly expanded, including through innovations such as lifelong learning accounts being adopted by some countries, for example, France and I think Singapore as well. Also, the effort should include expanded partnerships with employers. Again, by way of example, apprenticeship arrangements that have been used successfully in some countries, notably Germany. More employer-based worker training and retraining could be encouraged. In the digital era, the role of the institutions of formal learning will remain important, but the role of the firm in adapting and updating the skills of their workers, I think will take on added importance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think retraining, reskilling, upskilling, and so the general tendency is toward more efforts to realize lifelong education. Am I correct? Okay. So then, Dr. Sukti, your turn.
Yes, thank you. So I agree with what has already been said by Professor Roli and Dr. Qureshi. The issues of public investment in education and skills and recalibrating the curriculum will become very important, is becoming important. It's not will, it is already becoming important. And we see from our work, especially if you look at TVET, TVET is very specific, linked to the labor market. There are major changes happening, for example, in Vietnam, where the government is already making huge investments in modernizing, if you say, TVET institutions. Then the institutions of public employment services in countries across the world are also becoming more digitally powered to serve different sections of the population. And of course, the point I made earlier, which also picked up the fact about the lifelong learning is going to become key in a digital age. Also, as we see the transition to the labor market not being just from school to work and therefore working for X number of years and then retiring. There are multiple transitions, which will also require multiple kinds of skills required by people over their life course. So these are going to be key issues. But there's one more point I wanted to make, and that's it, while we are discussing this change in the skills profile and the jobs that are being created will obviously require a certain kind of digital cognitive managerial skills. But those who are losing the jobs do not belong to that cohort. They're usually the low skilled or the middle skilled in services in industry who are likely to lose their jobs. So how does one deal with the skills of this section of the population? And that is also going to become a key issue for policymakers if social justice and reducing inequalities in the labor market is a major concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lorraine.
Thank you. I agree with the positions and points of views raised already. And I think, in fact, there's some study from the EU that about by 2025, right, more than half of the workforce needs reskilling. And even to Professor Rauli's point, I think there's factoids around about 80% of teachers themselves need digital and ICT training, right? So the task is big, and it cannot just be done, however, by the government and shorted by budgets, but also you need enterprises and the private sector to come in, right? I think the one other point I wanted to raise is on the side of innovation and edtech, like one, unfortunately, I don't have the slides to back it up at the moment, but edtech is one of the biggest aspects that private investors are going towards in terms of supporting and growing, right? And I think I would, again, it's a little seed, it's a seed of light, but I see the fact that if governments provide the right opportunity with regards to providing innovation, having the right infrastructure and in place, I think innovation that supports the creation of necessary contextuals, edtech type of technologies will flourish, right? So that's the big part, I think, that we should not forget. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now, so upskilling, reskilling, and then also the vocational training like Tibet. So how can the government and also international community, including multilateral investment banks, can help? So any insight? Anyone? Dr. Zia?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a role for the international community, G20 and multilateral institutions. I think, especially for poorer, resource-constrained countries, there is need for additional funding support. I recall a study done by the World Bank, which estimated that in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic after 2020, countries, developing countries may have maybe reducing. We have been talking about increasing investment in education and spending, but maybe reducing for a variety of reasons spending on education by up to 100 to 150 billion. Partly to reduce higher deficit that they had run up in 2020, reduce revenues. Maybe the donors are also fiscally more pressed. So they, for a variety of reasons, there could be reduction rather than increase in the kind of spending that we were talking about. So there is a clear role for the international community in addition to the kind of discussion that we've been having across governments on the priorities, the changes that are needed in the education and training policies. There is a clear role for the international community on the funding side, and also for governments to while they are in a fiscally tougher position now to give particular attention to ensuring that at least critical frontline education spending, particularly for vulnerable communities that have been impacted seriously during the pandemic, that kind of spending is secure and not cut. So
thank you very much.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, great response. Now I'd like to take up some questions from the audience. So we have only 6-7 minutes, but yeah, I think this is very important. So one question is, what strategies can be implemented to address the gender pay gap? And how can youth, women and girls be encouraged to participate more in decision making? Any Dr. Supti or Dr. Lorraine?
Okay, let me come in very quickly.
Yes,
this is obviously an issue that requires a multidimensional approach, legislation, seeing that legislation is being implemented, but also encouraging women and girls into the STEM kind of areas. A more digital, empowered education is going to be key. And what we find is that that it is a combination of also having the private sector more involved, so that when there are openings, there is some kind of awareness about getting in more and more women employees. And one point is very clear, is that women have really taken the brunt of this financial crisis. And as I said before, many have left the labor market altogether. So a lot of serious thinking is in order if we are talking about not only building back better from this crisis, but also building back fairer. Stop.
Yeah, thank you very much. Lorraine, do you have anything to add? No? Okay, thank you. Then the next question is
I'm happy to add.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead,
just quick points. Only from a UK perspective, whereby gender pay has been addressed as just pointed out by policy issues, and the best one they've done is to force companies to report gender ratios of pay because they don't like to be put in the spotlight. So a legislative, not easy, but a legislative way to do that is to force the disclosure of pay policies. And when it first happened, it really was a media storm because all those things we sort of knew went on were there in black and white. They were written down as figures. And people were trying to work out how come the same newscaster who was male and got twice the salary of a female newscaster. And that is a very difficult one to try and explain by the BBC, which was the case in question. They went to great lengths trying to explain it by skills and experience. And ultimately, they couldn't. There's no explanation other than the horrible things we don't want to mention, in terms of gender bias. So I think that's the one way to do it. The second way to do it, back to the STEM one, is role models. What you need to have is more successful females being role models for engineering, science, technology. And I think that's where I'm trying to look for silver linings in COVID. I think that's where, in the UK in particular, the scientists that have done the best in the COVID vaccines have been females, and they've been honoured. And so I think that's, if you're a young female looking at it, thinking, well, I never thought I could have a job working at a university laboratory designing vaccines. But the British one's been knighted. She's been made a female knight. And as of yesterday, I discovered, only because she's a neighbour, the Australian person has been made Australian of the Year in the UK for work on the vaccine. I think that's a great role model. I really do. So those are just a couple of points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, another question is from Paddy Padmanabhan. Technology has primarily decentralized and enabled democratization of education at all levels from K-12 to lifelong learning. Mainstream education content hitherto has provided for standardized learning. Question for panel. Is it the task of educationalists to control or regulate this evolving process? What can ecosystem create freely and innovatively? So, any response? So, Lorraine, it's your correct,
I'll start and let the others add, Sonobe-san. I think indeed it's a great question, right? I would say, I think there is a role of regulation in terms of the content and the certification. We can't just have anyone create like a random set of knowledge and put it there and say they're the certified, certified issuer of the capability for that, right? I mean, I would say yes if it's, for instance, I don't know, AWS or Google gives you a certification if you go through their cloud processes, and that's a different top, right? But I think there is a role for the existing content for K1 to 12 and the established knowledge base of knowledge to be regulated. But having said that, what I would think, and I think many places like Singapore, the US is great in this, is in the freedom of the ecosystem, whether it's in the use of technology to broadcast that or to transfer various bits and pieces that we know into different formats and bring it to different places in the world. That's where the innovation and maybe sandboxing and less regulatory forbearance is needed. But for content, I would say we would need some regulation.
Thank you very much. And one question from my respected thinker mailing fund. What research is underway on the right measures for education for giving young people better opportunities for income earning through their lives? Yeah, I'm not a specialist in education, but the Asian Development Bank and also ADBI are now working on the kind of quick measure or global measure of learning losses due to the COVID-19, a serious project, collaborating with the prominent expert in education school systems. So measurement is being done, but maybe Mei-Lin's question is kind of more deeper and broader one. So I don't know about the right answer. But so this session was about human capital and the impact of COVID in the digitalization era. So we have kind of confirmed, we share lots of ideas, especially, so there are huge learning losses, maybe because G20 countries, on average, the school closure lasted almost 40 weeks. And then, including other countries, then there are many countries which had 100 weeks school closure. So it's pretty sure, we are pretty sure that the learning loss is serious. And then there, those students who are affected by these school closures, especially those who had to, stop schooling prematurely, will have kind of lifetime losses. And then the younger students will be able to get the kind of training during their school time that the government and the school systems have to find a way how to mobilize teachers or volunteers to give the kind of recovery training for students. And then the people expect maybe the education technology will help. But unfortunately, there are many people who do not have a good access to even the internet or digital technology. That's why more support from the government and also international organizations support to the government will be very important. And also the digital transformation means, and also automation and the robot will mean the kind of replacement of low skill jobs. So that's why the education, we have to shift toward the lifetime or lifelong learning, including upskilling, reskilling almost continuously. So how to harness the technologies and also the policy making efforts to realize this big shift will be a huge challenge in the next decades. So it's time, and then I'd like to thank all the speakers for excellent speech and also the nice discussion and their nice responses to the questions from audience. So thank you very much from different time zones. Okay, so yeah, we have had a very good discussion. Thank you very much once again. And, this session closed.
Thank you, Dean Tetsushi Sonobe, and all of our honorable speakers for the plenary session. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a short 5-minute break. The next session will promptly begin at 3:20. Thank you.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together. Recover stronger.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are now entering the final plenary session of the 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue to discuss the way forward for G20 Indonesia. Chairing the session will be Dr. Shafia Muhibat, Deputy Executive Director for Research, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Muhibat joined CSIS in December 2000. Previously, she served as the head of the Department of International Relations and deputy head of Department of Politics and International Relations. Her research interests include issues of regional security in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN, maritime security, Indonesia's foreign policy, and development cooperation. She served in the panel of jury for the 2022 and 2021 Adam Malik Award. She earned her master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2003 and PhD from the University of Hamburg in 2013. We kindly invite our participants to post questions and/or comments during the Q&A session. For the audience attending here at the venue, please provide your question to any of our organizers, whom will then deliver them to the moderator. For the audience attending virtually, please write your question at the Zoom Q&A box or YouTube comment section. I kindly suggest to keep your questions short and straightforward. Don't forget to inform us your name, affiliation, and the speakers whom you would like to address your question, if any. Without further ado, may I please welcome Dr. Muhibat to chair the session. Dr. Muhibat, you may have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon from all of us here at the CSIS Auditorium in Jakarta. It's an honor for me to chair the closing session of the 2022 Global Dialogue. This closing session is titled Way Forward for G20 Indonesia in 2022. So in essence, this session will focus on inputs for Indonesia as the chair of the G20. Before we begin this session, I very much regret to inform you that Her Excellency Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati is unable to join us today because of an unexpected change in her travel schedule. So unfortunately, she will not be with us today in this session. But I do hope, and I'm pretty sure that we will still have a very fruitful discussion with our four very distinguished panelists that have joined us today, both here with me at the CSIS auditorium or online as well. So let me introduce very briefly our four main speakers for today. Our first speaker would be Professor Peter Drysdale, who is joining me here in Jakarta at the CSIS auditorium. Professor Drysdale is Emeritus Professor in Economics, Head of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research, and Editor-in-Chief of the East Asia Forum in the Crawford School of Public Policy in the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He is widely acknowledged as the intellectual architect of APEC. He is the author of a large number of books and papers on East Asian and Pacific economic cooperation and international trade and economic policy, including the prize-winning International Economic Pluralism, Economic Policy in East Asia and the Pacific. So welcome, Professor Drysdale. I'll introduce as well our second speaker who is joining us online, Professor Chang Yun Ling. I hope, Professor Chang, I hope you have joined us already online. Professor Chang is an Academy member of the Chinese Academy of Social Science, or CAS, and the chair professor of the president of Institute for International Studies, Shandong University. Previously, he has held various positions in CAS, among others, the director of International Studies, the Director of Institute for Asia-Pacific Studies, and the Director of Japanese Studies. He has as well held many other positions, among others, the member of East Asia Vision Group, member of Official Expert Group on ASEAN-China, and member of ASEM Task Force. Our third speaker joining us, I think all the way from Germany, is Professor Anna Katharina Hornich. I see you, Professor Hornich, on the screen already. Professor Hornich is the director of the German Development Institute and professor of Global Sustainable Development at the University of Bonn. Before joining the German Development Institute in March 2020, she was professor of social sciences in the marine tropics at the University of Bremen and head of Department of Social Sciences of the Research Group Development and Knowledge Sociology at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen. Last, but of course not least, also joining us online is Professor Jisman Simanjuntak. Professor Jisman Simanjuntak is a senior economist and the chair of the Board of Trustees of the CSIS Foundation. He has worked on a wide array of issues, many in the field of international economics and macroeconomics. He also lectures at various national universities and is the executive director of the Prasetya Mulya Business School until January 2004. He also serves as an independent commissioner at the Lipo Bank. So welcome to our all four speakers. It's indeed an honor for us to have all of you joining us today. So as I mentioned previously, that in this session we will focus on inputs for Indonesia as the chair of the G20 this year. During the past 3 days, we have heard various discussions discussing aspects of economic recovery, basically. And we have heard how a robust recovery will depend on a wide range of political, leadership, and global economic governance factors. So, today we will discuss into more in depth on some of these aspects that we have discussed also in the past 3 days. For example, what should global economic governance be like in a post-COVID-19 world? So I will begin with Professor Drysdale, who has joined me here. Professor Drysdale, if you would like to start off the discussion, please.
Thanks very much, Fia. It's really a huge pleasure for me to be back in Jakarta after a couple of years, more than a couple of years, and to join with my old friends in CSIS and renew an association that stretches back over 50 years. So it's a really great privilege and honour to be on this panel this afternoon, including with our colleagues online. I guess at a time when global cooperation is in very short supply, we need it more than ever. And that's the starting point of my remarks this afternoon. The COVID crisis, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, they've sharply aggravated the underlying trends towards protectionism and fragmentation of the global economy, and intensified growing global geopolitical competition. So we have some big problems on our plate, and this is the context in which Indonesia this year will host the G20. They're not easy problems to deal with in themselves. Recovery from COVID, economic consequences of Ukraine, the steady deterioration of global governance, and the spectre of climate change all loom as substantial issues in their own right, but packaged together as they come and have to be dealt with now, requires another level of cooperation altogether. And that's just the beginning, because convening the G20 summit this year will be a major challenge in itself, and I want to come back to that later on, because that's a challenge that precipitously has to be dealt with. In that context, it's probably worthwhile saying at the beginning, so that it's on the books, that Indonesia has substantial convening power to deal with these issues. And that's a big asset that Indonesia brings to the G20 presidency this year. The political pressures on the G20 itself are immense. The G7 and advanced democracies are aligning to exclude Russia, and the divide between the United States and its allies and the rest of the world, and China in particular, is deepening. And these geopolitical issues loom over the hosting of the G20 process. Indonesia must mobilise, therefore, its considerable strength in convening the meeting this year to prevent the G20 itself from falling apart. That's the challenge that we face. It's no trivial challenge. So the key to success will be developing a consensus, and that won't happen naturally, automatically. It must be an active process. A consensus on the principles for G20 participation and what's at stake in the G20 meeting itself. The starting point has to be a focus on settlement after the war in Europe, emerging from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's an issue that's on the table that has to be dealt with. It can't be put under the table. And so we have to face it. Acceptance of a global framework for action as a necessary condition for settlement of the war in Europe is a focal interest, therefore, in the G20 this year. If it's not dealt with, then the G20 is at risk itself of disintegrating. Permanent expulsion of G20 members is not an option. Perhaps self-exclusion may be an option, or suspension may be an option. But expulsion is not an option, so that's the first thing to make clear. But to make the G20 meeting happen with all of its participant nations will require high-level Indonesian strategic diplomacy, and that's essential to getting a framework for making the meeting work and having the meeting deal with these big issues which the world confronts today. So what's the way forward on this? The first thing is that we need a clearly focused G20 agenda and a strong narrative and rationale for the meeting itself and its capacity to deal with these four major global issues. Making that clear and what's at stake requires a very tightly focused agenda that has relevance to the global community. A bold new narrative that puts emerging economy problems and interests at the centre is the starting point. The focus in the last few meetings of the G20 has been on rich country problems, and narrow alignments have tended to develop among the rich countries on how to handle the geopolitical issues that confront the world today. The G7 has a comparative advantage in dealing with rich country issues. Only the G20 can internalise and represent emerging economy interests and the global interests in solutions to the problems that the world faces today. Indonesia can set the framework for India and Brazil to follow in their leadership of the G20 process. But a change in the narrative which is reflective of the global interests, including the interests of the largest part of the world, the emerging economies and the developing world, is an important challenge for this G20 presidency. The strength of the COVID bounce back in advanced countries has been very strong. You know, by 2024, advanced countries will have re-achieved their pre-pandemic output levels. Inflationary pressures are also already evident in many advanced economies. The danger is, the risk is, that the recovery process will fracture, and a two-speed recovery which leaves the emerging market economies behind will be the result. So the focus of the G20 is to ensure that that doesn't happen. Tightening monetary policy in advanced economies and the rising US dollar threatens a new taper tantrum for the developing world. And Sri Lanka probably is the first example of that already happening. Food and commodity price pressures that arise from the Russia-Ukraine war are particularly hitting emerging market economies. And you see the pressures of that in basic food markets here in Indonesia already. The risks of more COVID variants appearing and hitting weak healthcare systems in emerging and developing economies is real. All these issues affect G20 countries and the world beyond the G7 countries, which after all themselves comprise only 27% of global trade. So what are the priority outcomes for the G20 this year? The first thing is to host the meeting successfully, but not just to be a good host, a host that is cognizant of the issues that confront the world beyond the conflict in Europe and through the COVID pandemic, and takes that up to the leaderships of other countries, including the G7 countries, and makes it clear what's at stake in the G20 process itself. That's what's required of Indonesia's leadership of the G20 today. Last year's focus was on the problems of rich countries, corporate tax issues, multinational tax avoidance, digital transformation and climate change are issues, of course, that encompass emerging economy interests. Last year's tax deal was a welcome development. But the issues on which the G20 needs to focus today are different in character. And there are 5 of them, as I see it, in all. The first is to ensure that there's an open trade system that enables shared global recovery, the focus of Indonesia's G20 theme. This means modernising the multilateral approach to trade integration, not friendshoring where it makes no sense at all. We need to build in this process on Indonesia's success in going to the Osaka summit of the G20 with a non-paper on trade reform, and build that into the agenda of the G20 this year. That's a big cross-cutting issue that affects all the other issues on which Indonesia has rightly staked priority. The second big issue is strengthening the capacity of developing an emerging economy appeal to international financial crises funding in the circumstance of increased international financial risk and their exposure through lack of fiscal space and external shocks to the need for special financing arrangements. And so there should be practical developments include canvassing practical steps like swap arrangements to support countries in need in these circumstances. So that's the second big area of focus that the G20 needs this year. The third is to mobilise capital in support of investment in developing countries. The infrastructure agenda of last year needs to be carried through to this year in that context. And we need to expedite the transition to secure and cleaner energy futures, multilateral action on an agreed global taxonomy of green investments and reform of the Basel capital rules would assist that process, and that's a fix on which the finance track should focus. So let me conclude, Shafia, by just observing the takeaway points from my remarks, and they are these. Taking the message of the G20 actively forward at this time and at every opportunity in the coming months in the lead up to the summit is a critical task for Indonesia's leadership at the very top level and across the ministers responsible for the G20 process and all the officials involved. The G20 is needed for comprehensive economic and health recovery from the COVID crisis. The G7 only constitutes a fraction of the global economy that has to be carried through this recovery process, and that other big fraction, 2/3 of the world economy, need to be engaged fully in that process through the G20. The G20 is needed to deal with the economic impact of the war in Europe. Not the conflict as such, but what happens beyond the conflict, the settlement after the war that's necessary for a stable geopolitical circumstance after there is a settlement. We didn't wait till the end of the Second World War to frame an arrangement that assisted the recovery of defeated and victorious powers alike after the Second World War, and we can't afford to wait till after the conflict in Europe to frame such a set of arrangements to engineer recovery and reconstruction after the conflict of Europe. And so setting that up is a huge contribution that the G20 presidency of Indonesia might make to global peace, recovery and reconstruction. And the G20 is essential to defend Asia's multilateral interests. They're critical. Multilateral interests that transcend any geopolitical divides there are in the world today. There's a lot at stake in Indonesia's presidency. And I say, by way of conclusion, that Indonesia, of all the countries you could think among the G20 members, is best placed by its geoeconomic, its geopolitical circumstance, its natural national inclinations, and its leverage in dealing with all the big powers in the world to take this agenda forward. Thanks very much, Shabir.
Thank you so much, Professor Drysdale, for the very interesting remarks, especially on the key takeaways from what we expect for Indonesia in this year's presidency in the G20, and especially by laying out the 3 areas of focus which should be different from last year. As you mentioned, it was the more of the focus on the rich countries, and this year Indonesia should definitely bring the agenda of the developing countries. I'll quickly move to the second speaker for today, Professor Chung Yun Lee. Are you there? Yes, Professor Chung, you have the screen now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chairman. It's my pleasure to join this session with all friends. Just now, Professor Drysdale give his observation of the current situation. I quite agree. I was asked to talk something about macroeconomic situation and policy and G20's role. We all agree that global economy is facing the most serious challenges and pressures now. All the forecasts now lower down the future economic growth because of many reasons. I think probably the global economy is facing the most serious situation after the Cold War because of the combined factors which affect. Before the Russian-Korean War, we focused more on that pandemic. Now there is a war infection, the effects, so we don't know yet how long and how serious it is. So one, I think probably the key factor we have consider still the pandemic, how to, it's hard to say this end of this pandemic. So still we have to find a way how to recover that connections and cooperations blocked by the pandemic. That's one thing. And in China side, the situation is still not clear because it's spread to more places currently, and the government still takes a very hard, rigid measures try to control its spreading. Though there are some different discussions, and government try to relax some of the regulations, but still the situation is not very clear and greatly affect Chinese economy. The second, as mentioned by Professor Drysdale, is about the Russian-Ukraine war, and it's further lower down the forecast of the global economy, especially the European economy. And also it's a sideline effect. Now it's a U.S. emergent sentiment and against China. And so this may worsen the, American-U.S. relations and further, cut down a lot of connections and normal economic relations. We still wait and see how far it can go. The Congress just passed a new, law, so it's a lot of worrisome about the how far it can go because it's the largest two global economies, and it's very politicized, and a lot of confrontal sentiment and measures in the future, and so we still could watch how to affect the global economy. Formerly, China-U.S. economy gave a very strong backup of global economic growth. The third factor that is, we call the de-globalization, that is the global economy is more and more facing the political factors, interruptions. So for some supply chains, and so probably it's very difficult to rebuild up. And people worried about the global market would be dividing to more and more small circles. And, so this is really negative to global economic recovery, and especially supply chains, which were established in the past. So they have, I think the direction is not clear how to rebuild and how affect the current and future global supply chains. Another factor, I think, that is we have seen that almost all this global regional organizations and so have failed to play a good role in facing of such a serious situation. So G20, it's a lack of consensus, and as mentioned by Professor Drysdale. So this year, how to make the consensus is a great challenge, and the people's discussion may focus more at the beginning, may break these sessions, and because of the current war, and then war follow up, different sentiments. So the G20 is quite different compared to when it was set up. And, G20 is a result of 2008 global economic crisis. So at that time, and it was very easy to bring all the major parties, including developed and developing countries, and to make the consensus on how to, support the global economy, how to take the concerted actions on the economic, recovery and so on. But now it seems it was highly divided. And as I mentioned, I'm really worried about this, the current war issue come to the forefront, which, greatly affect what we, should do for G20 to support the global economy. So what we can do, I think, the global economic recovery and the economic growth is still the key issue for G20 of this year. And each country, of course, has its role to find a way to support economic growth. Like China now is just launched a new infrastructure project. And it was done after 2008. And, at that time, it's a consolidated, concerted action and to help the global economy. But now it seems it's more inward looking. And so how to make this individual economic policy to a concerted global, agenda. That's a big task for G20. That's one thing. The second, I mentioned the pandemic still a big challenge. And though increasing countries now open, but still there are so many different kinds of limits and complex arrangements. So it's how to make all these kind of concerted measures and to facilitate the transactions of goods and people. And, I think that's probably G20 should be put on the higher agenda. So facilitation of this all kind of connections and transactions, and in the facing of, we still hard to call it a post-pandemic but still, a pandemic period of time, how to make it easier. And as I mentioned, that Chinese government is considering how to make it easier, while it takes still very rigid controls of domestic. But how to make it, this more liberalized measures, and that is to put it together to facilitate the, I think, so G20 may consider some kind of integrated guidelines or rules and so on, and to make it easier, because each country has now divided different arrangements, policies, and that's one. The third, that is G20. It's a priority of a G20, as I mentioned, when it's created, established after the 2008 economic crisis. Its real aim is to bring major global economies for cooperation. So G20, I think, Indonesia has a critical role, as I mentioned by Professor Drysdale, to bring G20 members together for consensus building rather than, after the meeting more divided. So we should take some consensus on how to coordinate the domestic national policies and reduce the political barriers, and especially to take the concrete measures to support the less developed, poor countries, because they are facing very serious situation because of many reasons, and disconnected globalization, less opportunity for their participations, and the rising prices of food and energy and many others. So G20 should play the role how to mobilize international organizations and major economies to support the poor countries. That's another thing. Especially probably make the food and energy program to support the developing countries. Finally, I think that is the role of the East Asia. The East Asia, I think will continue to play the major role as a dynamic region for global economic growth. So East Asia should strengthen its different cooperation frameworks, and to make action-oriented, which probably expired the G20 cooperation at this critical moment. We have RCEP now, and we have open integrated framework. Whatever what kinds of differences, but still we have an integrated, not a divided region. So East Asia, I think Indonesia should, at the same time, in order to support G20, to let the East Asia cooperation frameworks to play a positive role and strong role in the global economic cooperation. So generally, I think we are facing a lot of new challenges, and these challenges, some of them is quite new, and we are facing a divided world. We are facing a stagnated global economy in the future. We are facing politicized, the politics come back, and that's a different the situation compared to the post-Cold War world. So, but our world are highly integrated. Whatever happens, we have to live together. So that's probably the spirit of G20, which Indonesia should play a special role to bring all the parties together. But it's not easy, and but you have to do. I stop here. Thank you.
Questions for Indonesia in the G20 presidency, especially, drawing out again all the challenges and some ideas about what we can do. I'll move on now to Professor Anna Katarina Hornich, who's joining us from Bonn. Professor Hornich, you have the screen now, please.
Thank you, Shafia. Thank you, panelists. It's a real honor and pleasure to be with you here today. I would like to well, of course, take up what also the previous speakers already underlined. Our world is going through multiple crises, and these crises are increasingly developing dynamics between them. They accelerate in many ways. And it's on the one side, these are of climatic nature, as we all know. On the other side, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be with us. And we have the year in which Indonesia has the G20 presidency, is tasked with it, and Germany is tasked with the G7 presidency, which of course means that we have a substantial chance here to further develop bridges between G7 and G20. By also building on the bridges between these two countries. And I would like to basically say a few words on three fields. First, on the G7 presidency of Germany, just to also give that background and contribute that to the discussion. Then would like to reflect briefly on G7, G20 out of the current geopolitical situation, and then would move actually to the field of global health to give an insight into the recommendations formulated by the Think7 process. CSIS is coordinating the Think20 process. The institute that I'm heading is coordinating the Think7 process together with a partner institute. And I would like to give insights into the recommendations within the field of global health that are being put forth to the G7. Now, the German G7 presidency formulated a presidential program focusing on 5 priority areas. A was a sustainable planet, basically here putting the focus on the needs of stabilizing our climate, our oceans, etc., and of course reducing biodiversity loss. Then second, economic stability and transformation, here looking at the overarching theme of economic recovery, moving out of the pandemic situation and stabilizing our financial systems, our economic systems. Third, looking into the field of healthy lives, and here I will speak a little bit further about, so basically assuring also the assuring a form of vaccine equity, which has been promised already or pledged under the UK presidency already. Fourth, then investments in a better future. Here also taking up the infrastructural discussions of the UK presidency and thinking it further, thinking about the Global Gateway initiative that had been put up following the UK presidency and embedding this also into the discussions with regard to investments into infrastructures that meet particular set of values. And then fifth, Stronger Together, it is named here, reflecting on the strengthening of social cohesion within societies, investments into social security systems, as well as into investments and the strengthening of democratic institutions that foster social participation, and strengthening the freedom of press and media. Now, this program was put up at the end of, but then officially announced on the 1st of January this year. And as we all know, on the 24th of February, the invasion of Russia in the Ukraine changed the situation substantially with regard to the discussions also within the German G7 presidency. The aimed for mid to long-term perspective that was built into the presidential program for at least some time was overclouded by a strong focus on short-term coping, on a direct reaction, and dealing with the situation that we have an open war in the midst of Europe, and we are now, of course, in a situation where it is about waiting and seeing. I think Peter Drisdale already underlined it, but also Professor Chang mentioned it. We are all observing, of course, the situation in the Ukraine itself, but also the transregional effects of the crisis. And in many ways, the longer term effects also with regard to the geopolitical situation we are in and what that means for the multilateral system, what it means for club governance formats such as the G7 and the G20, substantially depends, of course, also on the length of the conflict and the severities that might still have already unfolded and might unfold even further. So there is this element that we have a clear priority program for the presidency, and at the same time a changed situation that has to be taken into account and can also not be or must not be ignored within, of course, the now starting and ongoing discussions on the G7 level. Of course, the G7, and it was underlined already several times, is part of the G20, and that is crucial. We are very well aware of the fact that the music of the future in many, many ways is lying and playing in the G20. And it's crucial to strengthen the G20, which also means that that we must not basically strengthen the G7 in a way that it undermines the capacities of the G20. Now, having said that, we are fully aware of the fact that this is very difficult in the current situation. Peter underlined that the expulsion of a G20 member is not an option. I think that is important to stress openly. And at the same time, it is also not an option to not reflect on the situation that we have an open war here in the midst of Europe, and started by Russia. And of course, we have all observed the elections on the UN General Assembly level, where we have a situation where, rightly so, many world regions say, well, there have been a number of other wars before, and they were not made into such a topic or into a comparable topic, not led to the always required measurements on the multilateral level. So why now? So there is an element of it has to be acknowledged that that solidarity, and that the solidarity that is being asked for also by Europe, by many G7 countries, is indeed reciprocal solidarity, and requires that many promises that have already been made, pledges that have abstained from the UNGA election, and where we are fully aware of the fact that the situation that is caused by the invasion of Russia and Ukraine is being reflected on out of a geopolitical perspective and in the different world regions, also with regard to the heavy economic sanctions put up against Russia that have effects on many other countries as well, are being reflected on with a substantial caution. At the same time, and here I speak for the institute I'm representing, the German Development Institute, we embed the current situation into a larger process of autocratization processes and polarization processes that we observe since roughly 10 years and a tick more all over the globe, actually. The so-called third wave of autocratization that we observe, and that leads also to an undermining of the multilateral system. That's not the only process, of course. We also have seen a weakening of the multilateral system from within and installed by nations from basically all world regions. But we regard the current situation as another effect of these two processes, increasing autocratization processes. Globally, we are in a situation where 63% of the world population live in autocracies, as well as in an undermining of the multilateral system. And this I would like to now take as a bridge, basically, into the discussions of the Think 7 Global Health Group. This is the advisory process coordinated by the German Development Institute and the Global Solutions Initiative, bringing together basically think tanks from all G7 countries and beyond. Indonesia has been, of course, as the country holding the G20 presidency, substantially involved as well. Bringing together experts around the 5 priority areas of the G7 presidency in order to then put forth advisory papers and lead the respective discussions with the political circles in the 5 priority areas. And I would like to turn towards the Think 7 Global Health Task Force. It is a task force that has consciously held their advisory meetings together with the experts from the different G7 countries, as well as experts from different parts of the African continent. And as said, representatives from Indonesia were involved in some of the meetings as well, in order to be able to address the heavily discussed and necessary topic of vaccine equity and inequity. Now, for reasons of time, I will just walk us through the main recommendations of this task force put forth to the G7. And this is basically the recommendation to invest into and initiate a Global Health Compact 2030. And this Global Health Compact 2030 has 7 pillars, with the first being to fulfill already made promises. So reallocate and distribute the COVID-19 vaccines that were already pledged in the mid of 2021 under Ukraine presidency, but were only delivered up to 30% by January this year. So assure that the already pledged and agreed on contributions to global health from the former presidency are being fulfilled. Here the purpose, of course, is also to invest into the credibility of the G7 in the current situation, also especially necessary, and B, to assure a continuity across the different presidencies. Then we strongly underline the need to strengthen multilateral health governance and invest and lead. We call on the G7 leaders to lead a process where individual assessed contributions to the WHO are being increased and should make up 50% of the WHO financing by 2028. We even formulate the target of 75% by 2034. Now, this also then entails embedding of the ACT Accelerator as well as the COVAX facility within the existing global health architecture, and we recommend to establish a ministerial level priority infrastructure task force to give effect to this Global Health Compact 2030, also then bringing this Global Health Compact 2030 as a concept to the G20. We third underline the need to reduce the fragmentation of the global health architecture and system. And here we see or foresee the creation of an interagency standing committee for global health to improve coordination. This, of course, is only, this requires also as then the next step, substantial investments into the surveillance and pandemic preparedness. In that field, we need not only investments, but we suggest the establishment of a planetary health task force that monitors, surveys, and also prepares the response to human, animal, and environmental events that cause and have an impact on global health. And fifth, we argue for the investment into or the rethinking of the R&D infrastructures within global health. They are largely nationally organized. Here we argue for a multilaterally organized R&D investment and agenda setting framework that allows a joint agenda setting within the field of research and development for global health on the multilateral level. And that, of course, is something that we suggest that G7 takes forward and then also brings to the G20. And lastly, all of this, of course, is only possible by enhancing transregional dialogue and transregional dialogue around the health targets globally and jointly defined health targets. So here we suggest to initiate a range of new transregional health dialogue series where G7, G20, and beyond can basically come together in order to reflect on the main global health challenges as well as then jointly set priorities. Thus, this just as a small insight into the discussions within the field of global health and within the think tank community organized now to support the G7 and the German G7 presidency. Of course, the reason I bring this in is global health is always global politics, and we are in a situation where especially global politics requires additional attention in order to assure that the club governance formats that we have, and especially the G20, and then in dialogue with the G7 in ways supported hopefully by us, G7 will assure a strength of the multilateral system that we need in order to address multiple crises that we are in already.
Professor Hornich, sorry, could you wrap up, please? Because we're really running out of time. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Shafi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Hornich, for the valuable insights, especially on the some recommendations from the G20, from the T7 task force. So we'll move on to our last speaker, Professor Jisman Simanjuntak. You have the screen now, please.
Thank you, Fifi. First of all, I would like to extend gratitude to the three speakers, Peter Drysdale, Samyong Ling, and Anna Katarina, for the policy ideas
shared with us today that T20 Indonesia can build upon in the days and months to come. Rescuing G20 under the current hostile environment is really a very tough job for Indonesia. So I would like to appeal to our G20 friends to also appeal to respective governments and friends around the globe on the merits of rescuing G20, because G20 as second best compared to multilateral approach is badly needed right now. There is not that much that we have on the table to deal with global issues in a multilateral way other than G20 and G7. G7, as Peter Drysdale said, is much better to deal with issues of developed countries rather than the entire world as a whole. And of course, we would like to see this war, Russian-Ukraine war, ended through negotiation. And however limited the influence of Indonesia is, I think there is certainly something that Indonesia can diplomatically contribute to solution to this conflict and related economic sanctions, for which we are all paying a great deal now. Let me focus on a number of substantive issues which we plan to deal with and plan to include in the agenda of T20. We project a summit in September this year, and we still have time to single out about these issues. Please go to second last slide straight. Second last slide. Second last, please. Or continue. Continue. Yes. Of course, different conditions call for different policy responses. We differ from one another in the specific conditions facing us after the COVID and now after the Russian-Ukrainian war, and also the heavy-handed trade sanctions imposed because of this war. Where possible, economies with favorable conditions should maintain economic stimulus. And I include ASEAN here, ASEAN 5, and I think also Australia, and a number of resource-rich economies. And with a view particularly to protecting buying power of the poor, to protecting employment, because the slowdown that we are in right now is going to cost us in terms of rising unemployment. So protecting employment is going to be increasingly important. And number three, of course, stimulus to protect health. Citizens reskilling. We listened to the panel before this last, when they really emphasize the importance of protecting human capital, including reskilling, given the technology changes around us, particularly digital competencies. Of course, we made a lot of progress during the pandemic crisis, but still the access to digital technologies, digital competencies continue to differ across different social strata. So stimulus focused on social protection and social capital formation. Number two, we should not throw overboard market. We should not throw overboard multilateralism. And this is one of the threatening developments facing us right now. We tend to respond to the shocks inwardly. Yet we all understand the good things that we enjoy in life these days comes, among other things, to an important degree from the openness of the economies that we manage to maintain and to improve over the last 70 years or so, after World War II. So don't, please, government should appreciate how market mechanism has contributed to our welfare, and how openness has contributed to what we have today. Number three, aggressive investments in health security, food security. Food security is said to be under threat after the Russia-Ukrainian war because of the dependence of agriculture on fertilizer raw materials that originate in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Aggressive investment in energy transition. And we have big problems here because in many economies, fossil consumption is still subsidized heavily, including in our part of the world. A sustainable city, and this also is a must if we are to save the planet, as discussed earlier. Hard and soft infrastructure, particularly ones with short to medium term gestation period. So not too long, because if it is too long, then there is a danger that government spending ends up in inflation. Next, please. Next. I think Sang Yong-ling underlined this. We have RCEP in Asia. We have CPTPP. We have bilateral FTAs. We have bilateral FTAs that branch out of ASEAN. Of course, we have ASEAN Economic Community. And I think Zhang Yongling remembers our discussion in the 1990s about ASEAN FTA, Asia FTA, ASEAN 10+3 FTA. And then we have discussion about ASEAN 10+6 FTA that ends up in RCEP minus. And I think we should revive this discussion. This is my appeal to both Peter Dreisler and Sang Yong-ling. Let's sit together to discuss how we can build on what we have nowadays in terms of regional cooperation. I mentioned here parallel orders because in my view it's going to be very hard to get multilateralism going again in a meaningful way. So on our part in Asia, I think we should learn from how they deal with these issues in Europe, in the European Union. Another important one, following positive signals of a subsiding coronavirus 19, although there are still problems here and there, I think we need a kind of global protocol on COVID or COVID adjusted travel protocol, global COVID adjusted travel protocol. Tourism is a very big ticket in many of us, developed as well as developing economies. And the sooner we can agree on this, the better it will be for the recovery of the tourism sector. Lastly, rediscovery of development policies. Whatever initiatives do we discuss? Policy ideas require financing to be converted into reality, translated into action. And for this, I think it's time for us to rediscover development policies. Anna Katarina mentioned a number of specific ways in which this can happen under the G7 umbrella. And I also would like to underline the importance of access to technology progress in favor of developing economies. We all know without access to technology progress, developing economies and people, poor people in developing economies and developed countries will not be able to improve their relative position in the distribution profile. In the final analysis, access to technology is a must if we are really serious about attacking the problems of inequality. And in relation to global health, it was mentioned among others, a special treatment in regard to intellectual property protections in dealing with pharmaceutical and medical services, pharmaceutical products and medical services. These are just a few items that I would like to share with the participants in the hope, of course, that we can deepen our discussions about this and the other issues floated in so many meetings right now until we can come up with a coherent and realistic recommendations to the G20 later on. But again, we have a very difficult problem here, rescuing G20 process under a hostile environment. And this should not be a job for Indonesia alone. This should be a job for the entire world, for the entire T20 members, and of course also for the entire G20 members. Even though Indonesia, of course, will have to play an important role as leader for the year 2022. Thank you, Fifi.
Thank you so much, Professor Jisman Simanjuntak. So we've heard our four distinguished speakers giving their remarks and also some suggestions and ideas for Indonesia as a G20 presidency. this year. So the committee has given me a few more minutes to take some questions there are some questions already in Zoom. So we have about, I think, 10 minutes left for some questions. And I'll also ask our four speakers to maybe have some responses to each other with some of the things that has been discussed. A lot of ideas has been put forth. So perhaps I'd also like to ask all of them to make a brief response to the other panelists. We have heard some already ideas and suggestions. We heard about, some recovery policies and also ideas, for example, for new global recovery and growth fund. Professor Hornish also explained some recommendations of the T7 task force. Perhaps I'll begin with Professor Drysdale, if you have any responses to some of the suggestions that has been put forth by the other panelists.
Well, I think the overarching worry that emerges from this conversation too is that the war in Europe doesn't overwhelm the G20 process. My colleague Jung Ling made the point of the importance of avoiding that eventuality, and I think a number of suggestions have been made about that, and what the importance of it is. A number of the panelists have emphasised that the G20 is an economic policy framework, a framework for dealing with the big economic challenges that the world faces. And the conflict in Europe has impact on the global economy. It's already having impact on the global economy. I think the point I would emphasise is how important it is to bring that into the conversation in a positive way. It's a hugely negative thing, the conflict in Europe. But we have to think about how we exit from that hugely negative thing, and that's what the G20 can bring to the conversation in a positive way. We need to ring-fence the conversation. We can't predict what's going to happen over the next 6-7 months or so before the G20 actually takes place. If the conflict's still underway, and my own judgment is that that's quite probable, we still need to bring a positive conversation to the G20 table on dealing with the end of the conflict, a settlement after the conflict. Just the question on the trade front, for example, you can't talk about multilateral trade reform without considering the implications of what's happened to the trading system in consequence of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, quite justifiably, in the course of this war, and the winding back of those sanctions, for example, is a very important aspect of a post-war settlement in Europe. And bringing that forward into the conversation in a constructive way now will help inform the reform agenda, the multilateral reform agenda that we're on course to undertake in any case. So I'd make that observation about the central issue that's worrying people at the moment. Associated with that is Indonesia's role, and I just want to emphasise that. I think many people in Indonesia, by natural inclination, are inclined to underestimate the power that Indonesia brings to the convening of this meeting and what influence it might have. Being a good host is one thing, but there's more required in this circumstance. And what's required in this circumstance is not aggressive intervention in the settlement of the problems in the world, but a simple and clear statement of what the problems of the world are, how they can't be resolved outside the framework of this important group of nations, the G20 process, and what elements we need to put in place in order to resolve them.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Professor Drysdale. I'll probably now move on to Professor Zhang. I mean, you
Still on the same issue, I mean, you mentioned that you're concerned about, a geopolitical tension taking the front line of the next summit, which is something that a concern that's also been mentioned by Professor Drysdale. And you emphasized that recovery and growth should still be key issues this year. Professor Jiang, can you emphasize more on, explain a little bit more on that, on how you predict, how, the issues that will still be the focus at the next summit?
The war issue actually cannot be fully neglected. But what I try to mention is we should avoid to let it become a key, focus more on this kind of issue. Like G20 probably should discuss about the energy supply in face of sanctions rather than to change the sanctions. We cannot change it. But there are some alternative approaches how to secure the energy supply, let OPEC and others to play the role, how to coordinate of this kind of a supply networks and so on. This is probably G20 can be discussed. The second, I think, as I mentioned briefly, this time, international organizations like IMF, World Bank, and also some regional banks, and how to play the role to support that less developed economies, in such a serious situation, facing of increasing energy prices and food and prices and so on. Some countries already, like Sri Lanka, already has a debt crisis, and so I think that is probably the thing should be picked up. How to let it play a special and strong role in this serious situation. The third one, the people, almost forget that is climate change. We already agreed on. So this should be one of the major subjects, and continue to commit and continue to be a key issue. The war sooner or later will end, but we don't, as I mentioned, I'm worried about this spreading of the war because still several months ahead, we don't know what will happen. And if we're seeing the current mood and situation is very dangerous, I think. But however, we have to think about the future. So climate change should be one of the key issues which continue to play the role and so on. So it's in such a complex situation, we should pick up, which we should do. The G20 is economic institution, which brings, as I mentioned, the major economies of developed and developing together. So combining of a majority of a global economy, they can coordinate, and then the world economy will avoid to be in a worsened trend, and to save the global economy from the worst crisis, the late of this year or the next year. So.
So much, Professor Chang. I'll move on quickly to Professor Hornich. I mean, you mentioned some of the recommendations from the T7 task force. We heard earlier from Professor Drysdale that this year we really should focus on the interests of developing countries in G20. So how do you think we could manage the balance between the interest and the agenda of the G7 and the G20?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, let me repeat again, the G7 is part of the G20. Yeah? So I think that's very, very important to underline again and again, also to remind us, G7, of exactly this fact. And the music of the future is indeed playing on the level of the G20. It's not playing on the level of the G7. No? When reflecting on the topics of G20 and that have to be taken further and should also not be, must not be forgotten about by reflecting also on the situation in Europe currently, I think it's actually 4 areas. No? So it's the field of energy transition, climate and biodiversity. You can also count them as separate ones, yeah? But these are the grand challenges we had already. I agree, Professor Chang, we had already agreed on these. We know we need to tackle them, and we need to tackle them now. We cannot wait. Yeah? They do not allow any waiting time. Then, of course, the whole area of economic recovery, the debt issue, the strengthening of our value chains, partly also regionalization of value chains, and of course also a reflection on the financial instruments that we have. Third, the field of global health. That's why I brought in the recommendations only from the think tank task force, Think 7 task force on global health, because global health in many ways also carries that potential of continuing dialogue, continuing cooperation, even if the world is at the same time busy with other geopolitical tensions. And of course, then fourth, a conscious reflection of the multilateral system that we have, but that requires strengthening. So these are the 4 alleyways which I see and which are fields that need to be discussed within the G20 context. The G7 is contributing to it.
Professor Hornich. So lastly, of course, Professor Jisman Simanjuntak, and also maybe to also do a little bit wrap up of the session. With all these suggestions coming in, all of these ideas, what do you think Indonesia should do to ensure a successful G20 presidency?
Yeah. Thank you, Vivi. I think Peter Drysdale's point is very important. Statement of the problems in a very clear way that allow leaders and officials to understand that impact of the war is not to be taken lightly. And formulating this, I think, is one of the challenges facing us. Not to make it beautiful, but to make it effective as policy ideas. Number 2, the 5 points raised by Professor Anna Katarina, I think suits or fits very well with the Indonesia's agenda. Of course, there are small differences here and there. And for us, T20 Indonesia, we should continue to work on this. I think they are already mentioned in our various meetings, Professor Anna Katarina, but I think continuous dialogue between us and G7 can lead to a better presentation of these issues to the G20 leaders. Number 3, we are all challenged to get creative in dealing with a world where multilateralism is stuck, even though we understand we cannot do away with it. Multilateralism is indispensable because technologies as the main driver of life in our time are all global. We cannot possibly address them nationally or even regionally. In some areas, we really need multilateral mechanisms to deal with the many issues related to what is called now fundamental problems. Fundamental problems. One, of course, is governance. Second is inequality. Three is health of the planet. Four is health of biodiversity. And five, of course, what was already discussed in the first session just now. I don't know whether this is a word. De-scarring. Removing the scars that emerged out of the COVID-19. But now also, of course, the scars that emerged out of the Russian-Ukraine war and related economic sanctions. We don't have much time, but still a few more months to come in which we can elaborate on all of this, and contributions to making this attractive to policymakers is very much welcome from friends from T20 outside Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gisman. I'm very sorry for running way over time, but nonetheless, I would like to thank all of the four panelists for their very insightful remarks for all of us today. And hopefully there are some key takeaways that we can suggest to the Indonesian government with regards to the G20 presidency. So thank you again to all participants who joined us both here at the auditorium and also online. And thank you again to all of the panelists, and I hand back to the MC.
Thank you to our advisor to T20.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's regards to Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. Peter, how are you?
Thank you, Dr. Shafia Muhibat, and all of our honorable speakers for the closing session.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the last 3 days, we have engaged in discussion on COVID-19 and global health cooperation towards sustainable recovery and quality growth, macroeconomic issues in prospect of recovery,
reviving trade, investment, and connectivity, building human capital for social cohesion and inclusive digital economy, and way forward for G20 Indonesia 2022.
To present the closing remarks for the 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue, may I invite Mr. Yusuf Wanandi, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees, CSIS Foundation. Pak Yusuf Wanandi, you may have the floor.
Good afternoon to all of you. Well, first, let me thank you all audiences who have joined and are still joining CSIS Global Dialogue 22, virtually or live from this CSIS auditorium in Jakarta. I am relieved that we are not alone in this recovery journey. And we are looking forward, as Gisman said, to cooperate closer, including with the G7. I personally think that I learned a lot from the engaging sessions and our distinguished speakers. Unfortunately, Ibu Sri Mulyani could not attend today, and so we could not listen to Indonesia's responses on various important topics we have discussed for the last 3 days. We will certainly put together all our notes and write to the Indonesian government, or probably we will set up meetings to deliver our recommendations. And especially I would like to thank Gisman and ask him actually to take the lead in this effort. So allow me to share my notes and some valuable takeaways for us to ponder upon in this few days to come. We all agree that COVID-19 has shown that our economic and social systems are ill-equipped to cope with extremes. We see higher poverty rates and increasing inequality across the countries. However, I agree with Pak Luhut's remark at the beginning that not all are bad news. There is also some good news. COVID-19 also shows us a unique opportunity to remedy the situation. Considering how more crises and extremes are expected to happen in the future, we cannot afford to maintain the status quo. Countries around the world need to pursue a concerted effort towards an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable recovery. As Minister Tharman from Singapore has said, we need a fundamental paradigm shift, especially on how we manage the financing of all. Not to see it as an aid to developing countries, but as investments towards global public goods. We certainly could not change what has happened, but we can prevent the size of this pandemic from happening again. As discussed wonderfully in the first session on COVID-19 and global health cooperation, we need early surveillance systems to detect and contain viruses transmission at a local level, and we need to build capacity today to manufacture all essential health products and services. So, the G20 Indonesia Health Agenda, in which we push for a strong multilateral system to scale up investment in health for all, everyone around the world, is timely and important. Ladies and gentlemen, participants of the 22 CSIS Global Dialogue, we also discussed in the second session that recovery cannot only be a health, but bigger than that. The COVID-19 crisis has impacted our social economics in a different scale and speed compared to other previous crises. Ibu Armida pointed out that we are facing the triple challenges. First, socio-economic consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. Second, climate change and environmental degradation. And third, the worsening geopolitical tensions. These three factors will certainly undermine decades of development progress. So it is almost urgent for us to reverse this situation. What we should do is to put SDGs at the center of our recovery and future policies. It is in the interest of every nation to invest and reduce future costs. The G20 agenda in energy transition has put this issue at the forefront of the recovery as well. A structural change in how we work, travel, consume, and learn is extremely crucial in defining the pathway to achieve a net zero carbon future. Time is also noted as the essence of our actions, as we only have a limited amount of carbon budget to spend in avoiding environmental catastrophe. Effective multilateral platforms to facilitate investment and technology transfer around the world will play an even bigger role in this window of recovery. From a macroeconomic perspective, the Russia-Ukraine war has put the global economy recovery at risk due to soaring inflation and the potential monetary policy tightening. Mr. Klesens pointed out that the world should prepare for inflation coming to emerging and developing countries. He also noted that the rise in commodity prices is more broad-based, especially for metals and minerals and agricultural products, compared with the 1970s oil shock. Lastly, the China Zero COVID strategy puts more economic pressure on the region. As a source of global demand and the world's production hub, the slowdown will negatively impact global growth. Although the financial market is still resilient, the increasing volatility of the global economy makes policy responses more crucial to achieving macroeconomic stability and fiscal sustainability. G20 Indonesia aims to promote a well-calibrated, well-planned, and well-communicated exit strategy. To have a clear framework, the G20 should maintain dialogue with all stakeholders and commit to developing a synchronized monetary policy. Again, the geopolitical tension due to the war has fueled a more challenging international trade and investment condition. As a result, all economic projections have been downgraded, making a slower and more uneven recovery. Moreover, the bottleneck in China will also amplify the logistic price and put more pressure on the price level. In addition, with the ineffective multilateral trading system, the WTO, it is very likely for countries to maintain the managed trade and investment regime. One of the essentials of supply chain resiliency is mutual trust among countries. In recent years, the erosion of trust and willingness to cooperate has led countries to group with like-minded countries. Unfortunately, countries will tend to put their national security above economic efficiency due to the war. The G20 should address this problem if we want to move forward with a more robust trade and investment in the future. The G20 vision of inclusion and sustainable recovery will be a lot harder. However, the commitment of the G20 of G20 Indonesia remains on working together with all countries in a more resilient supply chain in the future through robust international cooperation. Lastly, the G20 should push the WTO reform agenda in supporting an effective multilateral trading system in the upcoming ministerial conference this June. It is also a huge concern that COVID-19 has long-term impacts on labor productivity now and in the future. The rate of digital transformation has wonderfully contributed to the recovery process, in which we are enabled to continue working and learning. But in many cases too, digital transformation helps in reducing carbon emissions through teleworking, so less commuting, and through paperless transaction. As what the G20 agenda highlighted, Indonesia calls for accelerated utilization and improvement of global governance and making the digital economy accessible for all. The digital divide needs to be closed to create a more productive inclusive, and sustainable growth. In this concluding session, I would like to express that as well as a platform for dialogue, I hope we all further learn the complexities and policy solutions of today's challenges from the previous sessions in the last 3 days. We should also remember that standing up for multilateralism has never been more urgent. Just like all the challenges that have been discussed, increasing geopolitical rivalry has also been an ongoing challenge to multilateral institutions such as G20. Notwithstanding us hosting this year's G20, it is in Indonesia's interest to defend multilateralism as our prosperity and security depends on it all. I would like to thank the team in CSIS who have put their time, effort, and thinking into preparing and running this event smoothly since day one. I dare to say it is a job well done. Thank you. Of course, CSIS Global Dialogue should not be held without the generous support, could not be held without the generous support from co-organizers, AREA, ADB, and T20 Indonesia. It is really the reflection of the G20 Indonesia spirit. Recover together, recover stronger. Lastly, I would like to give the highest appreciation as well to all distinguished speakers who had spent time and effort to be with us and share their views, and especially offer solutions for G20 Indonesia. The success of the Indonesian presidency for G20 and the subsequent ASEAN chairmanship would require all kinds of help from you, from academia, from relevant government officials, from civil society organizations, from Indonesia, from international organizations, and so on. And that is what we will continue doing in the future. In other words, there will be another CSIS Global Dialogue. I would like to stop here. I wish you a pleasant rest this weekend and a happy Idul Fitri for those who are celebrating. I wish you and your family a joyous celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yusuf Anandi, for the concluding remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of the 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue. Thank you to each and every one of our panelists, participants, and organizers that have contributed to this event. We trust that all of you have benefited from the remarkable insight that our speakers have shared with us in the past 3 days.
We hope to have your support and participation at the upcoming T20 Summit on the 4th and 5th of September 2022. And we look forward to physically welcome you to our next CSIS Global Dialogue. The 2022 CSIS Global Dialogue is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and co-organized by the Asian Development Bank, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and T20 Indonesia. And finally, in the spirit of Ramadan, we would like to wish all of you a pleasant Eid Mubarak and an enjoyable holiday.
Stay healthy, stay safe, and have a great day.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
At the current affairs where we witnessed lingering COVID-19 pandemic, global economic recovery remained unfavorable to be achieved. Global inequality rise to a level that never seen in the past decade. Mobility restriction policies resulting from COVID-19 prevention measures have disabled many communities to fulfill their daily needs. Risks of divisions between social groups exacerbated as the threat of scarring effect to the future generations, as well as increased risk of systemic default that put financial sector under pressure, have made the exit strategy from COVID-19 pandemic even more challenging to be executed. Such risks also result in prolonged trust deficit among countries that slow down efforts to tackle greater long-term issues, such as climate change and massive biodiversity extinction. All of these phenomena need to be followed with better formulation of economic and policy approach under one coordinated action. The Think 20, or better known as the T20, is the G20's official engagement group that connects think tanks worldwide. The T20 serves as a global ideas bank, bringing together experts from the most relevant think tanks and research institutes worldwide. The T20 develop and communicate research-based policy recommendations to the G20 leaders. In its 10th year, the T20 under the Indonesian presidency will be present to systematically produce practical policy proposals for G20 decision makers. This year, T20 highlighted 3 strategic issues. First, promoting greater cooperation for stronger, balanced, and resilient recovery. Achieving resilient and inclusive economic recovery simultaneously by global economies is essential to reduce the risk of having prolonged crises that affect unevenly across social classes. Second, advancing concerted effort for inclusive and sustainable development. Post-pandemic development in times of changing climates needs to also consider environmental issues, while also inclusive to all communities and aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And third, managing digital transformation to utilize technological progress. The unprecedented digital transformation as a result from COVID-19 pandemic should align with innovation that benefits communities worldwide. These strategic issues will be discussed further by think tanks across the world under the coordination of T20 Indonesia's 9 task forces. Together, these task forces, as well as all T20 participants, will join under our series of events. Alongside the support provided by these task forces, T20 Indonesia will be led by our lead co-chairs as well as executive co-chairs. The T20 Indonesia, hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia, both are think tanks that play important roles in policy-oriented research. Recover together, recover stronger.